Moves to reform police oversight are also happening at City Hall. Last month, Mayor Walsh announced a new task force on police department policies, and this week, three city councilors proposed changes in oversight by a civilian review board. We're joined by one of the councilors who also chairs the Council Committee on Public Safety, Andrea Campbell. Thank you very much for joining us, Councilor.
Thank you for having me.
Councilor, we do have a certain amount of oversight today over police conduct, whether it's from the DA's office or the kind of panel that is already in place. But aside from that, what's missing that you're concerned about?
So, right, there are various apparatuses in place now, but they're quite limited, and some have found them to be ineffective, including our current co-op panel that the city of Boston has. It's under-resourced, doesn't have broad power, and can only review a limited amount of cases. So the ordinance I put forward in partnership with Councilors Arroyo and Mejia looks to create a civilian review board that would not only be independent from the police department, including physically located outside of the police department. It would have an office that would be resourced with human capital and an executive director and specialists to support the board. The board would have broad power to investigate a whole range of cases and complaints, including subpoena power. It would also, in addition, have the ability to collect data and to release that data publicly, which continues to be an issue with respect to the department. And I'll add, it's an apparatus that allows residents and civilians to file complaints with the board, but also other police officers to file complaints against fellow officers or colleagues who may not be doing great things.
When you mentioned data, you reminded me about one thing that I've heard for many years, which is that the great majority of police misconduct cases seem to involve a very small percentage of officers. Could data help get at that, maybe?
Absolutely. And we don't have enough data now to really sort of define the scope of the misconduct problem, for example. We did just recently get some stop and frisk data, and I had to subpoena that from the department. It took a long time to get that information. And what we learned just from that data from last year is that 70% of the stops are Black residents, even though Black residents only make up a quarter of the population. And so folks on the ground who live in the communities in which I serve, which is largely Dorchester and Mattapan, they know this to be true, but there are other complaints that come forward where folks do not come forward to sort of complain about some misconduct or something that happened to them that wasn't a positive interaction with the police officer, because they don't feel like anyone would be held accountable. They don't find it easier to file a complaint. And so this ordinance truly, I think, creates a system that will hold folks accountable and make it easy for folks to be able to file complaints.
Well, what about the investigators for this board? Because in some cases, you're going to be second guessing the internal affairs department at the police department, which can have its own biases, of course, too. But I guess you want to have credibility and you need competence. Can you really lock that in when you create this board?
Absolutely. The ordinance includes numerous provisions with respect to training, and training that it deals with not only the laws that pertain to what we're talking about, but also it requires the police department to train the folks on the board, including the staff that support the board. There's a lot of organizations, including nationally, that support civilian review boards around the country. And I reviewed many ordinances and documents with respect to other cities that have civilian review boards in their training. So it's critically important that folks be trained, not only the members, but the staff as well. And this doesn't call for internal affairs to go away, but for an independent, more objective apparatus to oversee those investigations, and in certain instances be able to review the internal affairs findings. And then, of course, to also look at a wide array of cases that internal affairs does not necessarily investigate.
What about other cities around the country? Are there places that have boards like this, and are they able to get information from the people that they really need to talk to? Because I'm imagining maybe legal resistance from police officers to a board like this.
I anticipate there'll be challenges, whether it's legal or others who just don't want to change the status quo. But there are municipalities, Newark, Atlanta, San Francisco, Oakland. I mean, there's so many that were reviewed to be able to craft something here for the city of Boston. But I do think, that the theme that runs through all of the civilian review boards across the country is this idea of independence adequate power to investigate. Of course, the participation of civilians, adequate training, and as well as data collection, public reporting, public facing meetings so people understand what's going on, ease of filing complaints. And so we took all of these themes and incorporated them here for this proposed ordinance.
Of course, one of the other things that's interesting about the board that you have in mind is that the council would appoint more members than the mayor. I imagine people in the mayor's office, whoever that might be, saying, I don't know about that.
Well, the goal, of course, is to work in partnership with the mayor, but to create a model where there's true partnership in its formation. And that is, I think, gets at the theme of independence, right? We want something that's independent where the mayor, of course, and the police department can inform what happens with the civilian review board, but the council as well. Unlike other municipalities, the city council does not have as many formal powers as the other city councils from across the country where civilian review boards existed. So I was very intentional around including some provisions there to allow for greater participation by the council, since we are on the ground interacting with our residents, our police officers as well. And we, of course, want to be at the table when creating this accountability.
What if internal affairs exonerates an officer, the board looks at the same case and comes to a very different conclusion? What would happen next?
I think, there's a process in place where there would be allow the board to go through a thorough investigation, to do their own review of facts and make their own findings, to interview witnesses, to even go to particular scenes where an incident might have occurred, field visits. So there's a whole array of tools available to the board to be able to craft a disciplinary recommendation or a recommendation or finding for the police commissioner. And then hopefully for the police commissioner to do his own thorough review and adopt that recommendation. And if he does not, to then send back to the board very specific rationales and reasoning as to why he's not adopting their recommendation, which is critically important and doesn't exist in the current co-op panel model, which the panel makes a recommendation and that's sort of it. So there's a lot of opportunities to have a thorough investigation and a second look, which I don't think is a problem. And that's really in cases where there's a death involved or something very serious where this board should play a role in terms of accountability.
There's also a money issue here because there's a certain amount of expense in having this kind of a board. Under the current system, there's also the expense that we pay in lawsuit settlements. So how do you balance those two things?
Well, the goal hopefully is to create an apparatus of accountability with any lawsuits that the city is fighting with taxpayer dollars, that gets reduced, right? We don't want to obviously remain in litigation if there are legitimate cases that can be resolved through mediation or other ways as articulated in the ordinance. But I do think there's resources to fully staff this office and give it the resources it needs to be effective, whether pulling those resources from the overtime cuts in the police budget or other means. But what is important is that this office be resourced. And every municipality we looked at across the country had some resources available to it, and a lot more than what currently exists for our co-op panel. So this board and this ordinance really calls for a robust budget to support the work of the board.